Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Je suis ravi d'être ici au congrès annuel du Réseau Canada Fort et Libre. So you see, old habits die hard. Friends, I'm delighted to be here for the first time in several years, actually, at this conference of the Canada Strong and Free Network. Our country is badly in need of a conservative renaissance at the national level. Indeed, I think the future of the country and the future of our middle and working class families depends on it. But such a renaissance cannot occur, it cannot be accomplished, achieved, or maintained by a political party working alone. It needs organized support in the broader society, and that's what this organization, the Canada Strong and Free Network, can help do. Now, I know that this year, as you contemplate how to bring about that conservative renaissance, you're observing that this is the 30th anniversary of a critical milestone in the last such renaissance. I'm referring, of course, to the election of 52 MPs, including yours truly, to the House of Commons in 1993 under the banner of the Reform Party of Canada. The Reform Party of Canada went on to become a critical element in the eventual formation of the modern Conservative Party of Canada. You know, I tell people the Conservative Party of Canada, as I conceived it, is not simply a merger of two legacy parties, nor is it just an electoral coalition. It is a synthesis of three distinct conservative traditions in this country: the Toryism of Eastern Canada, the populism of the West, and the autonomist tradition of Quebec and French Canadians. This synthesis, populist conservatism, I've often called it. Now, that word populist has taken on a number of imprecise and often negative meanings. For instance, if you were to read liberal media around the world, which of course you should not do, there you will find that any election result that they like is, quote, democratic, and any election result they don't like is, quote, populist. Even in my time, though, in the hands of people like Hugo Chavez and others, the term populist had come to mean simple demagoguery. But the word populist was used in the 1980s and the 1990s by the Reform Party according to its original meaning. The original populists were a political party in the late 19th century. That party came out of the frontier agrarian society of the Western United States. The populists sought to represent the broad interests of the great mass of local people. Those people were overwhelmingly smallhold farmers and modest income laborers. They contrasted with the elites of the time, the railways, the banks, grain companies, and the like, those who possessed enormous monopolistic economic power and controlled the traditional political parties. They were actually quite small in number and represented organizations headquartered hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The original populists died out, but such movements continued to arise in both the Western United States and Western Canada for decades to come. Those movements could be of the left, of the right, or of the center. But what really united them was the belief that the bulk of the population shared common interests and values that the elites who controlled the system simply ignored. Alberta, of course, has a unique history of populism. For most of the first century of its political life, its politics tended to be dominated by a single, broad-based political party, extensively organized and connected at the grassroots level. Most relevant here was the history of social credit. In 1935, in the midst of the Great Depression, a truly desperate electorate gave a landslide victory to William Aberhart, an evangelical preacher. Aberhart's program was then, even for the times, a radical populist agenda. Very, very anti-establishment in substance and tone. When Aberhart died in 1943, his young lieutenant, Ernest Manning, converted that populism into what was policy-wise a largely mainstream conservative party. But it was one that right to the very end kept its roots among farming class, working class, and middle class people. You know, it's now conventional to remember social credit for its, quote, funny money ideas, which Aberhart had actually discarded, which Manning had actually discarded. As well, it's also remembered for some of the other peculiarities of the era, which, by the way, were peculiarities in a lot of other places at the time, not just in Alberta. However, it's indisputable that social credit's mix of conservative policy and a populist ethic created a long period, a 3 decades long period of inclusive economic development that laid the groundwork for the prosperity that Alberta enjoys to this day. Now, fast forward to the late 1970s and 1980s, when I was as young as Jamil, and some of you in this room. Back then, that period, we had low and slowing economic growth, periodic recessions, high and rising inflation, so-called stagflation, which, by the way, the liberal elite at the time said couldn't really happen, and if it did, it must just be temporary, and therefore we should ignore these problems in favor of broader, quote, social priorities. If that sounds a lot like today, it should, because today does, in fact, exactly resemble that time. Governments and central banks in Canada and elsewhere in the democratic world have in these past few years implemented the economic policies of the 1970s, and as a consequence, we are getting the economic results of the 1970s. And by the way, this looks like the 1970s in other ways as well. Back then, democracies were suffering from profound internal social and political divisions, and in the world, democracy itself was in retreat. And authoritarianism, especially Soviet communism, was on the rise. But then we had a new generation of conservative leaders, Reagan, Thatcher, and others. They contradicted all the established wisdom of the elites, and things changed for the better. And in fact, they changed for the better quite quickly. Within 10 years, the Soviet bloc was collapsing, stagflation was a thing of the past, and by the 1990s, the model of free markets and democratic societies was spreading around the world, the beginnings of what became globalization. Now, it's important for younger generations to understand this. Reagan and Thatcher and that group were not from the political and business establishment of the time. Indeed, especially in the early days, they were almost universally opposed by that establishment, even in their own political parties. The Reform Party was in part a product of that era and was broadly similar in orientation. I should say we advocated overall very orthodox economic policy, yet at the same time being portrayed as radical by the media and rejected by the elites. The way, by the way, to be blunt, that Pierre Poilievre is today. Pierre, of course, having been way back then a reformer, a very tiny reformer at the time when I was first elected. But in spite of that opposition, Reform's economic policies were eventually adopted, ironically, mostly by the Liberal Party under Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin in the 1990s, mid-1990s, and this country, Canada, which was becoming an economic basket case by the time Pierre Trudeau left office, gradually turned around. Now, I tell this story, by the way, not just to give you hope for the future and a not too distant future, but I tell you this story also as a testament to the superiority not just of well thought out market-based economic policy, but also as a testament to the importance of the democratic system of government. There's a lot of criticism of democracy these days and a lot of challenges in the democratic world, pretty serious ones. And democracies, if we're honest, rarely get things exactly right at any point in time. But democracies are adaptable and resilient. And over time, when it becomes obvious that countries are on the wrong path, democracies have a way of correcting error, changing course, and revitalizing themselves. It happened like that in the 1980s, as I say, when I was a young man. If my father were here, he could tell you that it happened like that after the 1930s, when he was young and when the challenges faced by the Western democratic world were much more serious than anything we face today. It's happened again. This kind of rebirth and revitalization has happened again and again over the generations. So, populist conservatism that I talk about is a belief both in free markets and in democracy. But to go back for a moment to the early days of the Reform Party, the truth is that populism was not really a choice for us. It was a necessity. The Reform Party was founded in 1987, 6 years before that historic breakthrough in 1993. In those early years and many years after, the party had no real corporate support and very few large donors. Initially, we didn't even have any full-time professional staff. In fact, in the beginning, Reform was ineligible for the subsidies and tax credits that the established parties got. In fact, the Reform Party was even forbidden by law in its first election to buy the election advertising that the traditional parties were entitled to, if you can believe that. I was the chief policy officer in those days, and I can remember going with Preston or just myself and a couple of others, just myself and my friend John Weisenberger smashing up his car. That's a whole other story. Anyway, we were going from town hall to town hall alone and raising money by stump speaking and passing KFC buckets. That's how we actually raised money for the party. So in such an environment, it was essential for the party, including for this young academic conservative economist, to figure out pretty quickly how to become a populist in the sense of responding to the actual concerns of our members and supporters who were ordinary middle class and working class people. And that kind of populism is a very good thing. And I believe that the approach of those early days continued to manifest itself in the economic success of our later conservative government. I see a lot of people in the audience who played a role in that. And let me just summarize that record. It is that, despite going through a global economic crisis, this country experienced steady income growth for Canadians across the income spectrum, from the top to the bottom. We had record investments in things like healthcare and infrastructure, but ended with a balanced budget and the lowest federal tax burden in over half a century. We also left a free trade network expanded from 5 to 51 countries and done with strong public support at a time when populations elsewhere were turning protectionist. Now, friends, that record stands, I think, in stark contrast to the policy war being waged these past few years against working Canadians and their families. I could point to monetary policy, which has created out of thin air renewed inflation, eroding the budgets of all modest income households in this country and affecting the largest upward transfer of wealth in our history. I could point to an elite-driven climate change agenda, which is forcing the cost of energy transition entirely on ordinary middle-class consumers and taxpayers. Of course, we shouldn't forget tax policy, which has been marked by tax hikes across the board for all kinds of small business, workers, ordinary middle-class people, while at the same time sparing the corporate sector, the big corporate sector, from any increase in the corporate tax rate. That is what elite liberalism looks like. And of course, it runs counter in every way to the populist conservatism that previously governed the country. And friends, I never hesitate to say that the first architect of that modern populist conservatism is the man who's going to join me up here on the stage in a moment for a conversation. Preston Manning and the Reform Party, as I say, had a huge influence on the politics of Canada, one that I think, frankly, is underappreciated. Reform, as I said, already changed the debate in the 1990s on fiscal and economic policy and paved the way for policy changes that for 2 decades got this country moving in the right direction. It also changed the debate on constitutional and unity policy. It developed the first Clarity Act and led to a government more sensitive to provincial interests, contributing in the process to a long-run decline in both Quebec separatism and Western alienation, at least until recently. It changed some important things in terms of how political parties operate and how they're run. The Reform Party brought back the detailed party election platform, which had virtually vanished. It brought in national membership lists. People forget that way back then, often constituency associations were tightly controlled, effectively rotten boroughs for sitting MPs. Reform brought in more participatory grassroots structures, including leadership balloting by members in place of brokered conventions. The fundraising experience I told you about earlier laid the groundwork for the comprehensive reforms my government made to party fundraising, making parties dependent on a marketplace of small contributions rather than on a combination of big donors and government subsidies. And that, by the way, that system, by the way, doesn't include support from foreign governments. I just thought I would mention that. I don't know why. I hear it's topical. Anyway, few people will also remember a little contribution. Will remember that the Reform Party was instrumental in largely ending desk thumping, one of the House of Commons' oldest and most obnoxious practices. But of course, most importantly, the Reform Party ultimately made the modern Conservative Party of Canada possible, obviously with other elements as well. And let me talk a bit about Preston Manning's role in that. You all know Preston Manning as the founder of this organization and the founder of the Reform Party before that. What many of you may not know is that Preston Manning's conception of a broad, modern, populist conservatism predates the formation of the Reform Party itself by some 2 decades. In 1968, Preston Manning did the research for his father's book, Political Realignment, A Challenge to Thoughtful Canadians. That book was the first attempt to conceptualize and advocate the creation of the kind of conservatism that found expression in the Reform Party of Canada, in the Canadian Reform Conservative Alliance, and finally in the modern Conservative Party of Canada. And this much also needs to be said. I, of course, am very proud of my role as the first elected leader and first Prime Minister of the modern Conservative Party. I'm the only Prime Minister to have come to office in this country since Confederation through a third party. But that could not have come about without the work of Preston Manning. No one else since Confederation has created a new political party at the national level that would be so successful as to eventually become, at least in part, the Government of Canada. No one else. And to build such a party from virtually nothing is not just a unique accomplishment, but a manifestation of a skill set that very few people will ever possess. It is not something, for example, that I could ever have done. And it is why I say that Preston Manning is the closest thing we have to the founding father of the modern-day Canadian Conservative movement. So let me welcome to the stage to discuss the breakthrough of 1993 and a few other things, the Honourable Ernest Preston Manning.